Good morning. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's hearing State-Controlled Religion in China will come to order. Welcome. My name is Vicki Hartzler, and I serve as chair of the commission. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, is an independent, bipartisan U.S. legislative agency created by the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act, or IRFA, as it's known as. The Commission uses international standards to monitor religious freedom abroad and makes policy recommendations to the U.S. government. Today, USCIRF exercises its statutory authority under IRFA to convene this hearing. I'm delighted to share that we are joined today by Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, who will share some opening remarks, followed by the chair and vice chair's opening remarks. And next, other members of Congress have submitted pre-recorded remarks, which we will hear. And then we will hear from our distinguished witnesses testifying about the freedom of religion or belief in China. So, Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, thank you so much for joining us.
Madam Chair, congratulations to you, knowing of your work in Congress on this subject. I'm just delighted that you have this distinguished honor to serve as chair, and it's a blessing to all of us. Thank you for your welcoming remarks, and thank all of you for your participation. To the Vice Chair, Mahmoud, where's Mahmoud? Welcome to you as well, and the commissioners of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. In convening this important hearing. I'm going to just talk about a few things, but I do want to commend John Molinar, our colleague, and Jim McGovern for their work, their principled leadership. They have been remarkable. I've seen them in action. Most recently, John Molinar spoke at the Taiwan anniversary, their National Day. He was remarkable, putting forth principles of democracy and faith. Jim McGovern as well. So again, for years, the world is watching horror as the Chinese Communist Party has carried a systemic campaign to erase faith from public life and replace it with loyalty to the party. Under Deng Xiaoping, the Sonization of religion, entire communities have faced unspeakable persecution. I'm just going to say a couple of things. This is not exhaustive of what they've done, but representative. Tibetan Buddhists, I know you're going to be hearing more about this, see their monasteries desecrated while being denied the right to venerate His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Just a brief story. When President Xi was in the United States, Senator Feinstein and I spoke to him about Tibet. He said, well, you haven't been there. You haven't seen all the great things we've done in Tibet. You should go there. I said, well, for 25 years, I've been trying to get a visa for Tibet. I assume that you're giving me a visa right now. And so we took a delegation to Tibet. Jim McGovern was part of that. And what we saw was heartbreaking, because what we saw was the Sinonization of Tibet and religion there. He said, oh, you should see, we put gold, and we fixed up the roof of the temple. I said, I don't care about what's in the temple. I care what you're putting in the minds of the children there. But what we saw was a complete hypocrisy. We were surrounded by spies, I guess you would call them, the whole time we're there. But what's so sad about it is that the children, they're trying to deprive them of their culture, of their religion, of their language and the rest, but their faith. Faith is what gives people hope. I wear these bracelets. Faith. People say, where's hope? I said, it's where it always has been, right between faith, hope, and charity. If you believe in the goodness, charity, and love that is out there, it gives you hope. And the people of Tibet believe, and so they have hope, but that's being diminished, that hope, by my teenagers in San Francisco say to me, hope is our resistance. They're Asian, and so they share our concern here. And I said, well, resistance is our hope in all of this in terms of faith. The Uyghur Muslims endure unending oppression, detained, sterilized, brutalized for daring to practice their faith openly. My side story on that is when President Trump was at G20 a number of years ago in his first term, I said to him, I know you can't bring up what's going on in the streets of Hong Kong because, President Xi is there, but you can tell President Xi that House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans are concerned about Uyghurs. We have resolutions of this or that. It's bipartisan, it's bicameral. So you tell him that. So the next day he calls me back and he said, this is when he was in Japan for G20 and President Xi was there. He came back and said, mentioned to President Xi what you said. And he said, oh, they like being in those camps. Imagine. That's what he thinks is a good, not he, Xi thinks is an acceptable answer. Christians are harassed and imprisoned, forced to worship in state-controlled churches. And I've been to those state-controlled churches, and they look like a Catholic church. But I also know what they're doing, martyring Catholics and Christians. They're taking down signs of religion, replacing it with their own structures about it. I work with Cardinal Zen for decades on this subject of Catholics there, but it applies to Christians as well. Even the physical architecture of faith is being torn down and rebuilt to serve the party's interests. These are not isolated incidences. They're part of an organized campaign to subordinate every belief in every person to the control of the state. As Americans, we have a moral duty to speak out against these atrocities. Thank you for doing that today and every day. And if America does not speak out, I always say, if America does not speak out against human rights violations and rights of freedom of religion in China, we lose all moral authority to speak about it any place in the world. For decades, this commission has given voice to the voiceless and has stood shoulder to shoulder with the persecuted from Tibet to the Uyghurs, from Hong Kong to Beijing itself. And throughout, support for international religious freedom has remained a bipartisan cornerstone of America's foreign policy, expression of who we are as a nation and what we believe as a people. For decades, Democrats and Republicans alike have spoken together with one voice that defending human rights and religious freedom is not a partisan issue, but a patriotic duty. For the witnesses, advocates, and communities represented here today, thank you for your courage and for your unwavering commitment to protecting the freedom to practice your faith. I'll just say this one more thing. This is personal. I grew up with this attitude in my family. When I was born, my father was in Congress from Maryland, Madam Chair, and he testified in Congress. He worshipped at the shrine of Franklin Roosevelt. You can just imagine, one of the few and early Italian Americans to serve in Congress, worshipped the shrine of Franklin, except when it came to the persecution of Jewish people in Europe. He didn't think America was doing enough. And so he went to the floor of the House and he spoke, and this was his record. He said, Mr. Speaker, over 2 million, this was early in it all, over 2 million people, Jewish people, have been killed, murdered in Europe only for what they believe, for their faith. They have been murdered. And this information is well known to the administration and in the archives of the State Department, which was a real charge against the administration, even though he worshipped at the shrine of Franklin Roosevelt. So that prioritizing of faith and people being persecuted for has been something in our family for a very long time. And I always think of it when we're doing this, that what you are doing with this commission is making it well known, and that's the knowledge of it all. And for those who are being persecuted, the word getting back to them that this commission is speaking out for them gives them, those with faith, and the goodness of you, hope. Thank you for giving people hope.
Oh, thank you so much, Speaker Emeritus Pelosi, for your words, your encouragement. And yes, we want to be the voice for the voiceless, and you certainly have done that throughout your life, and the legacy of your father is being carried on so well. So thank you for being a champion of that, and for for your heartfelt words and examples today. I think that is a great way to start our hearing, to hear the practical implications of what the Chinese government is doing. So thank you so much for spending time with us today and helping to kick off our hearing today. You know, in the People's Republic of China, there's only one entity that the government allows unwavering faithful devotion to, and that is the Chinese Communist Party. The state compels Chinese citizens of all backgrounds to adopt and enthusiastically profess their love and support of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP as it's known. Anyone who places something, some other being, belief, thought, tradition, way of life, culture, or activity above the CCP, its political ideology, and its chairman, Xi Jinping, is considered a threat. Instilling and maintaining absolute authority to the CCP forms the basis of the Chinese government's policy on religion. For decades, China has tried to exert complete control over religious groups through laws, regulations, and policies that are not meant to protect and maximize religious freedom, but to instead facilitate the CCP's political agenda. The Chinese government recognizes Buddhism, Catholicism, Islam, Protestantism, and Taoism as religions, and any groups affiliated with these groups, though, must register with the government to practice their activities legally. State-controlled national religious organizations and their local subsidiaries, often known as patriotic religious associations, manage the religious affairs of these groups and the report to the CCP's United Front Work Department and the government's State Administration for Religious Affairs. Through these organizations and government agencies, the government severely restricts religious groups and micromanages their affairs, including their leaders, houses of worship, missionary activities, and online activities. If this unfettered interference weren't enough, the government has committed gross religious freedom violations in the name of the state's synonization of religion. And this is a policy, a project that seeks not only to regulate religious affairs, but to force the CCP into the center of religious life by making groups conform to their beliefs, their activities, expression, attire, leadership, languages, houses of worship, and more to CCP ideology. With this policy, the government seeks to eliminate any ideologies that contradict its own, and they transform religion into a tool for CCP indoctrination. China's treatment of religious groups blatantly contradicts international human rights standards. No government has the right to dictate the beliefs of its citizens. No government has the right to choose which religious leaders are legitimate. No government has the right to impose its political interest onto its citizens' conscience and its citizens' faith. And no government has the right to imprison religious leaders for leading their religious communities. We think of the recent detention of Zion Church founder, Pastor Ezra Jin, as well as the brutal arrest of dozens of other religious leaders and church staff in multiple regions across China this past weekend. I condemn these arrests, and I call for the release of Ezra Jin and of all those who've been detained by the CCP for exercising their right to practice their faith. USCIRF will add to our website a statement submitted to us by Pastor Jin's family for the record. With that, I would like to now turn the floor over to USCIRF's Vice Chair, Asif Mahmood.
Good morning to all, and thank you, Chair Harsler. I would also like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today to share their knowledge and expertise. The regulations and policies the Chinese government enforces on recognized religious groups have resulted in particularly severe violations of religious freedom. In Xinjiang, Chinese authorities have committed genocide and crime against humanity by placing more than 1 million predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and other Turkic ethnic groups in so-called political re-education camps. Their officials have forced them to renounce their religious beliefs and ethnic identities and subjected them to other gross human rights abuses. In Tibet, authorities have repressed all expressions of Tibetan Buddhism that do not align with the CCP's political goals. Officials imprison and torture Tibetans for their private and public support for the Dalai Lama. Authorities have appointed CCP compliant Tibetan Buddhist leaders that promote the government's forced assimilation policies. China targets house church Protestants and underground Catholics for refusing to join the state controlled religious organizations. Authorities have instructed clergy to preach CCP ideology, ordered the removal of crosses from the churches, and required the display of CCP slogans at the entrance of churches. Those who resist risk harassment, detention, imprisonment, forced disappearance, and even torture. These are just violations for recognized religious groups. The government has ruthlessly prosecuted unrecognized religious groups like Falun Gong and the Church of Almighty God in an effort to eradicate their movements as opposed to co-opting them for political purposes. For decades, the US government has been a leader for combating China's religious freedom violations. It has sanctioned Chinese government officials, banned the import of goods using Uyghur forced labors, and supported independent media and non-government organizations denouncing violations. USCIRF urges the US government to continue prioritizing religious freedom by designating China as a country of particular concern, raising religious freedom issues with Chinese officials, and supporting independent civil society. The United States cannot afford to sit on the sidelines on this issue. The lives and well-being of millions are at stake. Thank you, and I would like to turn the floor back over to Chair Hartzler. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Mahmood. Before we turn to our witnesses, we'd like to share pre-recorded remarks from 4 members of Congress. The first message is from Senator James Risch. Senator Risch is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for the 119th Congress, for which he previously served as chairman during the 116th Congress. Senator Risch's committee's assignments include the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources.
Hello, I'm Senator Jim Risch, Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Thank you for inviting me to provide remarks for this timely hearing today. We've watched for years as the ever-increasing oppression of religion in China continues. It is disturbing. Under Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party has tightened its control over religious practice to scientize religion. China has imposed mandates that religious practices reflect socialist core values and pushed to harmonize religion with party-approved Chinese culture. Most people are unaware that for a religious organization to even exist in China, that organization must apply for and obtain a permit from the government, which of course is the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese government has also forcibly eradicated religious elements that are not in line with the CCP's agenda, destroying access in churches and replacing images of Jesus Christ with Xi Jinping. Just this past week, Chinese police detained dozens of leaders of the Zion Church, one of China's largest house church networks. It has forcibly assimilated children in government boarding schools in Tibet to strip them of their Buddhist practices and has forced thousands of Uyghur Muslims, including Ekpar Asat, into prisons and mass forced labor programs in Xinjiang. Outside Xinjiang, China jails thousands of practicing Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, and Christians each year for their religious beliefs, with many subjected to forced indoctrination and torture. It is truly despicable. And sadly, the evil of the Chinese Communist Party has spread to Hong Kong. Following the implementation of the phony national security law, Hong Kong authorities targeted pro-democracy religious groups and activists like Jimmy Lai. Jimmy, a devout Catholic, has tragically been denied Holy Communion in prison. As chairman, I will continue to advocate for his release and all those falsely imprisoned by the Chinese government. We all know that religious freedom provided to all is actually a stabilizing force in a society. It is unfortunate that China's leaders can't accept this reality. President Trump is a champion for people of faith and religious freedom in the United States, and he continues a long and proud tradition of U.S. support for religious freedom in China. Under his leadership, I'm confident the U.S. will continue advocating for political prisoners like Jimmy Lai and Ekpar Assad and hold the Chinese government accountable for its violations of religious freedom. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to continue work to protect the God-given right to religious freedom for all people.
Thank you, Senator Risch. The second message is from Senator Ted Budd. Senator Budd serves on the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, and the Joint Economic Committee. Senator Budd is leading efforts to ensure that the United States stays informed on China's potential future capabilities.
Good morning. I'm Senator Ted Budd from North Carolina, and I want to thank the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom for holding today's important hearing. One of the most sacred rights given by God is the freedom to exercise your faith. It's a right enshrined in America's Constitution. American leadership is critical in denouncing persecution of Christians and other religious groups around the world. Sadly, the Chinese Communist Party has no interest in protecting freedom of religion, with reports that the CCP continues to restrict religious practice, destroy churches, and imprison religious minorities. Every day, they torture and target Uyghurs, Tibetans, Catholics, Protestants, and Falun Gong practitioners. This record of religious persecution is evidence of the CCP's disregard for human life and natural law. Until China changes course, it should be the policy of the United States to hold them accountable for their severe violations of religious freedom. As long as they continue to wage war against faiths of all types, the United States should continue to designate China as a country of particular concern. We will consider every other tool available, economic pressure, trade negotiations, and diplomatic measures, to confront the CCP's abuses and make clear that religious persecution is not acceptable. I hope today's hearing will not only expose the wrongdoing of the CCP, but also strengthen our resolve as Americans to unite in defense of those who face religious persecution and to protect those around the world who simply seek to worship freely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator Budd. It was excellent. The third message is from Representative Jim McGovern. Congressman McGovern is co-chair of the bipartisan Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, as well as a commissioner on the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which monitors human rights and the rule of law in China.
Thank you for the opportunity to offer a statement at the Commission's hearing on state-controlled religion in China. I am sorry I cannot be there in person. The right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion pertains to every person in every country under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It is a universal right, as your Commission's work recognizes. I am pleased to see the Commission returning to focus on religious freedom in the People's Republic of China. The violations of this right there are vast and pervasive and in constant need of scrutiny. USCIRF addresses this need through your annual report. Along with the State Department's yearly report on international religious freedom, Your documentation relies on the work of countless NGOs and advocacy organizations that monitor and advocate for religious freedom in China. I am happy to play my part in the effort as a current member and former chair of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. 3 years ago, I co-chaired a hearing on the growing use by Chinese authorities of digital tools to surveil and suppress religious expression online. As these reports have documented, the Chinese government's restrictions have hit many communities very hard: Uyghurs, Hui, Muslims, Tibetans, Catholics, Protestants, and more. I am pleased to see that today's witnesses will provide updates on these communities and provide recommendations to policymakers. Inside China, these communities lack the ability to advocate for themselves. To do so invites further persecution. USCIRF plays a vital role in giving voice to those who cannot speak out in defense of their universal rights. Standing up for the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion in China demands that we be as principled as we are vocal. The moral authority behind our efforts to protect the right to religious freedom is greater if we protect it at home. We must lead by example, and I am worried, quite frankly. A few days ago, Chinese authorities launched a multi-city crackdown on the unregistered house Zion Church and detained several individuals, including Pastor Ezra Jin. The State Department issued a strong statement. I join in this condemnation. But at the same time, I read that the bishop of the Diocese of San Bernardino, California, told the 1.2 million people in his diocese to stay home for Mass on Sundays to avoid being detained by ICE. We see other reports of government agencies violating the right of sanctuary. How can we credibly speak out against the Chinese government forcing worshipers underground when our own government is doing the same? How can Americans expect to be taken seriously on the world stage if our leaders are failing to defend religious freedom here at home? This is a serious concern that must be addressed so that the United States can be a helpful partner in the important work discussed here today. Let us be consistent and diligent in working together to advance universal human rights, and especially the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion in China and around the world.
Thank you, Congressman McGovern. Finally, we have pre-recorded remarks from Representative John Molinar. Congressman John Molinar is a member of the House Committee on Appropriations, but he also serves as chairman of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, which works on a bipartisan basis to build consensus that addresses the threats posed by the government of China.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. It's good to see Congresswoman Hartzler leading this meeting. Vicki and I have worked together for many years in the House, and she's been a steadfast advocate for religious liberty. My committee and I appreciate the Commission's work on religious liberty and your focus on China today. China is the world leader in religious persecution. The fundamental idea of religious freedom that our nation was founded on has spread to many countries around the world, but it does not exist in China. The country is led by the Chinese Communist Party, a brutal regime that has committed a genocide of Uyghur Muslims and slaughtered tens of millions of people over its more than 100-year existence. The CCP doesn't just threaten American interests, it threatens the very idea that human beings are born free, that truth exists beyond the reach of the state, and that no government can claim ownership of the soul. Under Xi Jinping, the CCP has declared war on faith itself. Across China today, the party is carrying out the most systematic campaign of religious persecution since the Cultural Revolution. They call it sinicization of religion, but what it really means is subjugation. It demands that every conscience, every congregation, and every creed bow to the party. Here's what that looks like in practice. Religious leaders who refuse to join party-controlled patriotic churches are detained, disappeared, or silenced. Crosses, crescents, and domes are torn down. Religious architecture is stripped and rewritten to erase faith from the public life. Independent congregations are shut down. High-tech surveillance now watches over every place of worship, tracking who prays and who preaches, even following exiles abroad. New laws make it nearly impossible to operate unregistered churches or host foreign missionaries. Unrecognized groups like the Falun Gong, the Church of the Almighty God, face detention, torture, and there are even reports of forced organ harvesting. And in Xinjiang, more than 500,000 Uyghur Muslims remain in camps, victims of an ongoing campaign of genocide and forced assimilation. These are not isolated incidents. They're the work of a system that cannot tolerate allegiance to any authority higher than the party. The CCP's campaign to synthesize religion is really an effort to replace God with the state. The message is simple: worship the party or pay the price. That's not strength, that's fear. A regime confident in its legitimacy does not need to bulldoze mosques or arrest pastors. It doesn't need to surveil prayers. But the CCP knows that people who believe in a power higher than the state will never truly belong to it. Just last week, Chinese authorities detained Pastor Jin Mingri, founder of Beijing's Zion Church, one of China's largest underground Christian congregations, at his home. Pastor Jin has family here in Washington, and that connection reminds all of us that the CCP's war on faith reaches across oceans. It touches our institutions, our friends, our families. We must never turn a blind eye to China's religious persecution. Thank you to Chairwoman Hartzler and all of the commissioners for your work. May God bless you, your work, and those who speak out in the name of faith.
Thank you so much, Congressman Molinar. And now I'd like to introduce our witnesses. First, we'll hear from Robert Destro, Professor of Law at the Catholic University of America. Professor Destro is a former Assistant Secretary of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and a former U.S. Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues at the U.S. State Department. We will then hear from Rushan Abbas. Mr. Abbas is founder and executive director of the Campaign for Uyghurs and chairwoman of the Executive Committee of the World Uyghur Congress. Her testimony will be followed by Norgay Tinson, research analyst at the International Campaign for Tibet, and then Corey Jackson, founder and president of the Luke Alliance. Lastly, we will hear from Annie Wilcox Boyajian, president, and Mark Palmer, distinguished fellow at Freedom House. Their full testimonies can be found on USCIRF's website. Professor Destro, you may now begin your testimony.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Madam Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, members of the Commission. It's a great honor for me to be with you this morning. And I thought that the setup that you just had with the prepared remarks of the members of Congress and the Senate, Speaker Emeritus Pelosi, it was a reminder to me of the time that I spent inside the State Department, because once you get all of the reports on what's going on, and not only do you get the reports from wonderful groups like the Uyghurs and the Tibetans and others, but you also have access to sensitive classified information about what's going on in the country. And so for the diplomat, like I was, the answer isn't, oh, it's a bad thing. We know that. The question is, what do we do about it? And one of the great revelations that came to me in my capacity as Assistant Secretary was that everything is thought about in bilateral terms. In other words, I'm going to have to go sit across from some Chinese diplomat, and I'm going to have to convince him or her, to move toward the position that the United States government has. And that it's a different perspective than advocates for religious freedom have. It's certainly changed my view a little bit about how we deal with this. So let me start with a couple of questions that I'd like you to think about, because as my written remarks say, I think the Commission has a very, very important role to play in the formulation of our foreign policy. And it basically rests on this proposition. And that is, our human rights generally and religious freedom specifically, kind of niche issues, that can be dealt with once we deal with the realpolitik, like critical minerals and tariffs and other things, or are they the lens through which we should be formulating our policy? Okay, I'm of the latter view, that the human rights are basically integral to our policy. We have to act in the international field just like we do at home. Okay, and now I want to also point out that Mr. McGovern made a good point, which is if we're not being serious at home, I don't agree with the premise of his question, but I do strongly believe that we have to put, as they tell you on the airplane, you have to put your own face mask on first and then help the people around you. Okay, so here I'm going to pose 3 questions. The first question was one I was literally amazed at, because I started asking as soon as I got in, well, what does a good relationship with this country look like? You would be amazed at how few times that question gets asked or answered. And if you put it in the context of China, what does a good relationship with China look like? We know that it means we don't want to have a war, but we also know who's sitting across the table from us. And so what I want to remind you, there was a recent hot mic episode between Chairman Xi and President Putin, where they were discussing the use of transplanted organs to live 150 years. I want you to think about that for a minute, because if you're an American diplomat sitting across the table from the Chinese, they're looking at you as perhaps somebody they can get a liver from, right? I mean, it's when you actually look at the forced organ harvesting issue in China, that's who we're dealing with. And guess who, are among the first people to get their organs harvested? First, you have to have a genetic match, obviously, but for customers from the Middle East, they want halal organs. So that's where the Uyghurs come in. The Falun Gong have been used for organ harvesting for quite some time. That's who's sitting across the table from you, right? So you have to be very realistic. And so how in a setting like this, so then you say, all right, who's on my negotiating team? You have to convince our own diplomats that religious freedom is an important issue. And many of them don't think so, because they are believers in realpolitik, right? And say, that's kind of a soft issue. We're worried about tariffs. Well, I can give you lots of ways in which you could use tariff authorities to advance human rights. And I'm not talking about sanctions. I'm talking about very creative ways to use the tools that we have. And I mentioned those tools specifically on page 7 of the materials that I gave you. And they are, according to the Religious Freedom Act, diplomatic, political, commercial, charitable, educational, and cultural, among others. Okay, so we have a big toolkit. And so the next question, which again, I come back to Mr. McGovern's point, does our policy toward China internationally and here in the USA reflect that vision? So do we actually think that religious freedom is an important issue domestically? Because if we do, our foreign policy should line up with that. And I can give you chapter and verse of many ways in which the United States government has sought to control religion abroad. The ongoing controversy over the splitting up the Ukrainian Orthodox Church might be Exhibit A on that. But coming back to that, it's like, how do we align our policy? And this is where I think the commission fits in very nicely. I'm not going to take much more time because I think my time is up, but I'll be interested in hearing your questions. But what I really want to emphasize is the need to sit down with the new assistant secretary and perhaps some of us who have served in that role to think about how the commission's authorities can be used to shape our policy and to get it consistent both internally and externally. This is not I have a little section in my written testimony about the interagency, which is something that doesn't really work, but you all could be a very, very useful catalyst in getting that conversation to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Destro. That was great. We look forward to the Q&A to discussing this further, but I appreciate those comments. So now, Ms. Abbas, you can begin your testimony.
Thank you so much, dear Madam Chair and the Vice Chair Commissioners and the distinguished panelists and the valuable guests. Thank you for this opportunity for me to testify. As it has been said a few times earlier with our representatives, and they are respectful, honorable Robert Distro, what's happening to my people today will define the moral limits of our time as the CCP wages war on religion, war on democratic values, humanity, war on Uyghur women and the children with its current full-fledged genocide against the Uyghurs. Uyghur women's bodies have become the battleground of this genocide through forced sterilizations, forced abortions, the government-sponsored mass rape of the Uyghur women through forced marriages to the Han Chinese men. Studies have shown that in some Uyghur majority areas, birth rates have dropped down to 0. The Chinese embassy in the United States even tweeted proudly congratulating those genocidal efforts, and they said, Uyghur women are no longer baby-making machines. A 2025 report by the US Holocaust Memorial Museum confirmed that all of the policies that have led to accusations of mass atrocities either continue in my homeland or are currently expanding. They list these crimes as mental and physical torture, family separation, forced labor, birth prevention, and the assimilation of children remain entrenched in as a state policy. In 2024 alone, over 3.4 million Uyghurs have been transferred through labor transfers torn from their families and forced into state-controlled factories producing goods that enter the global supply chains. Uyghurs are being used as modern slaves. This is a deeply personal and painful issue for me. In 2017, 24 members of my husband's family disappeared into the camps. My parents-in-law, my husband's, all of his siblings and their spouses, 14 of his nieces and the nephews, they all disappeared. His sisters and a sister-in-law were taken for just wearing headscarves and praying. His brother was sentenced to 21 years for practicing normal Islamic traditions. So I spoke out about this in September 2018 at the Hudson Institute in Washington think tank about those detentions and China's genocidal policies, outlining fate of my in-laws. As a retaliation for my actions, Chinese authorities abducted my own sister, Gulshan Abbas, a retired physician, from her home in Urumqi. Later, she was sentenced for 20 years under the sham charges. Her imprisonment meant to silence me from speaking out. Today, 2,600 days have passed since my sister is in jail. As she remains unjustly imprisoned, countless others endure the same fate. This is not history. This is happening now on our watch. The CCP claims authority above God. Religious leaders and the scholars vanished into camps and the prisons. Over 16,000 mosques have been demolished or turned into nightclubs, bars, and the tourist exhibits where the Uyghurs are instructed by the government to dance and sing. Any normal elements of practicing religion are being criminalized. Technology has become a weapon of repression. AI flags indicator of beliefs. Religious practice is all banned, and this year only the Uyghurs were ordered to film themselves eating daily, eating or drinking during the daytime to prove that they are not fasting. Miss one recording, and then that person and the family face punishment and disappear. For Uyghurs, the assault on religion is an instrument of genocide. Beijing lies and calls it counterterrorism. But in truth, it redefines faith itself as a threat to justify erasure. The CCP seeks to destroy the foundation of the Uyghur life and engineer a population stripped of memory and conscience. At the same time, the CCP has perfected propaganda into a science, flooding the internet media and universities with false narratives designed to confuse, divide, and deny. Their goal is to make the truth impossible to recognize. And Beijing has invested in projecting a favorite image in the United States, promoting its authoritarian values and attempting to infiltrate an American society. Propaganda tours were recently, very recently, for with Princeton University Press and the America K-12 students presenting choreographed scenes of happy Uyghurs to deny the genocide. 2 weeks ago, Philadelphia raised the CCP's flag to mark its founding. Honoring the flag of a genocidal regime insults every victim of repression and our values in this country. The CCP system has become a blueprint for control. Through surveillance and technology profiling people by faith and ethnicity, China is exporting repression as a service. We must confront this machinery of repression by enforcing sanctions on those complicit, banning surveillance tools of religious profiling, demanding accountability on Beijing's crimes. I have submitted a written testimony that includes detailed recommendations. This fight is about protecting freedom of belief everywhere. I urge you to act urgently to defend every person's right to worship. And I want to conclude my remarks with what the Desmond Tutu reminded us. I quote, "If you are neutral in a situation of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppression," unquote. Silence is the oxygen for the dictators. We are together in this fight. This is no longer just the Uyghur issue. It is an assault on human dignity and democracy, a threat to all humanity, to the freedoms that you have worked so hard to build. And I stand before you today, not only on behalf of my people or my sister, but also in defense of those values that unite us all. The future of the free world and our democratic values are what's at stake. We are all responsible for what happens next. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your powerful testimony. And I would encourage people to go on the website and read your entire testimony. It's excellent, very insightful and heartbreaking at the same time, but we appreciate it. We will now hear from Norgay Tinson. Mr. Tinson, please begin.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I would like to thank the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom for giving me this opportunity to testify on state-controlled religion in China. For this hearing today, in my testimony, I will examine how the Communist Party of China exerts control on Tibetan Buddhism, focusing on the political motives, the institutional strategies, and the mechanisms used to regulate and influence the Tibetan religious faith and the leadership. I'm also submitting the full text of my testimony for the record, and for the hearing here, I will give a gist of my testimony. The cultural and the national identity of Tibet is deeply intertwined with the Tibetan Buddhism, a religious tradition that has shaped Tibet and the Tibetan ethos for the past 14 centuries. Through periods of prosperity and adversity, the Tibetan people and the monastic community in specific have steadfastly maintained the integrity of their religious practices, philosophical teachings, and the artistic traditions. Since the 2008 Tibetan protests, the Chinese authorities have intensified repression through surveillance, strict controls, laws, and policies aimed at eroding Tibetan identity and faith. Under Xi Jinping, even more draconian restrictions have been imposed on the monastic community and the Tibetan people. The Chinese Party State's campaign to sinicize Tibetan Buddhism represents a deliberate and aggressive strategy to bring religious institutions under stringent party control. Far from being mere rhetoric, this policy has been methodically implemented through a series of steps within the CCP apparatus and the state system. Steps specifically geared to profoundly impacting Tibetan believers and the monastic communities' daily life by institutionalizing political control and indoctrination. These policies have been codified in regulations that tightly control Tibetan Buddhist practices and institutions. For example, Article 4 of the revised measures for the administration of Tibetan Buddhist temples, which is in effect since January 1 this year, explicitly requires that the Tibetan monastic community to love the Chinese motherland, support the leadership of the Communist Party of China, uphold the socialist system, adhere to the sinicization of religion, and adapt Tibetan Buddhism to a socialist society. Article 14 of the measures requires the monastic administrators to conduct political education for the monks, to restrict the mobility of the monastics seeking knowledge from their teachers outside of their home monastery. Article 30 imposes a multi-tiered approval process for monks and nuns seeking to study at another monastery, requiring applications to the monastery management, township and county level government, host monastery registration, and final authorization from the local Buddhist association and government offices. This complex bureaucracy restricts monastic mobility and limits access to the religious teachings outside state-approved structures. On June 30, 2025, the CCP overseeing Buddhist Association of China introduced the measures for the certification of qualification for Tibetan Buddhist clergy, mandating monks and nuns to pass a multi-level review for a 5-year renewal certificate, enforcing CCP loyalty, socialist values, and sinicization as announced by the Kanzi Prefecture Buddhist Association. Unlike traditional Tibetan Buddhism, which lacks such a certification process, these measures further impose political control over the monastic community. Besides legal measures, there are multiple political processes aimed at assimilating Tibetan Buddhist monastics into the overarching Chinese national identity through propaganda campaigns and indoctrination programs. Party state authorities take groups of Tibetan monks across Tibet to Beijing and other mainland Chinese cities for political indoctrination to, quote unquote, foster a strong sense of community and national identity. On top of indoctrination tours, Chinese authorities conduct unabated mass political indoctrination sessions in the monasteries. Living under such strict controls and orders to comply with authorities creates a suffocating environment for the monastic community, leaving no choice but to comply with compliance or risk targeting by the authorities. The death of the 57-year-old Venerable Hunkar Dorji Rinpoche in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, in late March this year, illustrates the consequences of non-compliance with official directives. Since June 2025, Hunkar Dorji faced escalating harassment and abuse after refusing to comply with the Chinese authorities' orders to provide an elaborate welcome for the government-installed Panchen Lama state-organized tour in his hometown. Under immense pressure, Hunkar fled to Vietnam, where he later died under suspicious circumstances. His body was cremated in secrecy at 1 a.m. on April 20, 2025 in Ho Chi Minh City, under tight control by approximately 40 Vietnamese police officers and 30 Chinese officials, with cameras and recording devices strictly prohibited to prevent transparency. In July, Tibetan Buddhists and supporters worldwide celebrated the life and legacy of the 14th Dalai Lama as he turned 90. However, inside Tibet, the atmosphere remained tense and subdued. Between July 1 and July 6, government officials held meetings in all monasteries across Lhasa. Politically active regions such as Ngaba and Zoge faced intense stability maintenance measures. These measures have real effects on the ground. For example, on August 18 this year, Shesang Gyatso, a 52-year-old senior leader at Tsang Monastery, took his own life following heightened state surveillance around the Dalai Lama's 90th birthday, mandatory ideological indoctrination, interference with traditional religious practices, and the forced expulsion of young monks from his monastery. For the past 6 centuries, the Dalai Lama, Tibetan Buddhism, and Tibetan people have been deeply interconnected with the land of Tibet. This profound relationship, rooted in a Sikh belief system, is one the Chinese Party state seeks to co-opt through its laws, policies, and practices. Despite these challenges, the 14th Dalai Lama affirmed in May 2025 that the institution of the Dalai Lama will endure. He emphasized that the responsibility for the search process for the 15th Dalai Lama rests exclusively with the Ganden Potang Trust, the Office of the Dalai Lama, and who, in consultation with the heads of the various heads of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, will search for and recognize the future Dalai Lama in accordance with the established tradition. No other entity has authority to interfere in this matter. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tinson. We appreciate it. We will now hear from Mr. Corey Jackson. Mr. Jackson, over to you.
Thank you, distinguished members of the United States Commission on Religious Freedom. I am a Presbyterian pastor from Cary, North Carolina. I lived in China between 1998 and 2005. I've been so moved by the increasing persecution of my friends enduring under the Communist Party in China that I recently left my job as senior pastor of a church here and to launch the Luke Alliance, which supports Christians in China through global advocacy and pastoral care. Today, I've been asked to provide testimony about the repression of religion in China, particularly as it impacts the Christian community. The CCP attempts to control every aspect of life, including the freedom of religion of Christians. They require that all churches formally register themselves as state-sanctioned 3 self-churches. All that do not are deemed illegal. As a result, unregistered churches and their members face persistent repression, including surveillance, harassment, eviction, confiscation of religious materials, and the forced closure of places of worship. Building or renting spaces for churches is prohibited, and Bibles cannot be sold in bookstores or made publicly available. Pastors of unregistered churches are particularly vulnerable. Many are placed under house arrest or subjected to travel bans. Some pastors are imprisoned on broad national security charges such as subversion of state power. Others are also frequently arrested on charges of quote unquote illegal business operations or fraud. Pastor Wang Yi has been detained in prison near Chengdu for almost 7 years on charges of subverting state power and illegal business operations. He and his family are friends of mine. Wang Yi, whose case has been widely reported, was a pastor at Early Rain Covenant Church. He's been charged and sentenced to 9 years in prison when all he did was preach the message of Jesus Christ in the face of a government who aims to control every square inch of your life. He has reportedly lost 50 pounds in prison, and while he languishes in prison trusting in God, his wife and only child have been kept under house arrest for these past nearly 7 years. And has been mentioned by several of you, and we really appreciate your solidarity and the condemnation of these actions. Just in this past week, on October 10th, we witnessed the largest crackdown on a single house church in the past 40 years. Many US-based and global media outlets have reported that Zion Church, whose founding pastor is Mingra Ezra Jin, was the focus of a nationwide, carefully coordinated crackdown. Ezra Jin's wife and daughter are also my personal friends. 30 pastors and Christian workers of Zion were arrested, and 8, potentially 10, we're trying to get the right number, were forcibly taken into police custody. 22 remain in jail today. So far, we know that Pastor Jin and the rest, all 21 of the others, have been criminally charged with illegally using an information network and are being held in Beihai number 1 and number 2 detention centers in Guangxi province. Luke Alliance's website has an updated list of the detained along with pictures of the detention notices with English translations for the public to read. We have other documentation there as well, such as statements from Ezra Jin's wife and other family members of detained Christians. This illegally using an information network charge seems to be an implementation of the new religious clergy laws that were announced by the State Administration of Religious Affairs, or SARA, in September. These regulations target Christians and other religious groups on a technological level, warning Christians to stop gathering online, to stop using AI to generate religious teaching, and they continue to implement this policy of not teaching children under 18 about your religion. So I'll close with this. Under such pressure, why do so many churches remain unregistered? For churches who do register, their pastors' sermons, seminaries, hymns, even Bible translations are supported to CCP ideology. In the effort to control religion and belief, understand what the CCP is communicating to us in the world. The CCP intends to control every area of your life, including your heart, your mind, your soul, and your emotions. They want to control your gathering in public, in private, online, even gathering with your own children to teach them about your faith. So how should we respond? Our concern should go beyond prisoners of conscience to the 99% of other Christians who do not make the headlines. There are between 80 and 100 million Protestants in China, maybe 10 million Catholics, potentially more. She brands Christians as disruptors, and in reality, they are a cohesive force for good in society. How can we stand with these 100 million plus Protestant and Catholics in China? First of all, I encourage you to please continue to exert pressure on the CCP to release Ezra Jin and the other 21 prisoners of Zion Church immediately and unconditionally. Secretary of State Marco Rubio swiftly condemned the PRC and demanded the immediate and unconditional release of these prisoners. Pressure the U.S., continue to pressure the U.S. government to apply pressure on China until every one of these 22 is freed. Continue to speak out for Wang Yi, who's been unjustly detained for 7 years. And please ask Congress, as Mr. Destro mentioned here, I'm sure his comments were more extensive than mine, ask Congress and the executive branch to impose religious freedom tariffs on China alongside other economic tariffs. Dr. Katrina Lantos Sweat at the IRI conference recently suggested that the U.S. place religious freedom tariffs on China. Whatever strategy is utilized, the U.S. should include religious freedom standards as a main consideration in all of our economic and national security negotiations with China. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. And we will lastly hear from Anna Wilcox Boyajian. Ms. Boyajian, please begin.
Thank you so much for the honor of testifying before you today on behalf of Freedom House. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to defending and expanding freedom around the world through research, programming, and advocacy. And we have actually been sanctioned by the Chinese government because of this work. One of the perks of going last is that my fellow witnesses have already covered so much ground, so I will try to be brief to leave plenty of time for Q&A. As the Commission knows and has detailed so well in the China Country Report, the Chinese Communist Party operates one of the most systematic and technologically sophisticated apparatuses of religious control in the world. You've already heard witnesses talk about the policy of sinicization. The new laws that many of us mentioned require groups to register all personnel, keep records of foreign contacts, and align doctrine with socialist principles. CCP cadres are empowered to monitor compliance, and surveillance cameras have been installed in churches, mosques, and temples. The state officially recognizes only 5 faiths: Buddhism, Catholicism, Islam, Protestant Christianity, and Taoism. But in order to legally operate, all must submit to a rigorous certification process. And as you have already heard, religious believers from all of these faiths will tell you it's difficult to actually practice your religion within the confines of what the state considers appropriate. Groups that are unrecognized or do not comply with registration are persecuted. Tibetan Buddhists, Muslim groups, Falun Gong practitioners, and Christian house churches face the harshest persecution. And peaceful practices by Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and Hui Muslims are routinely punished as religious extremism. As Ms. Abbas already testified, there is an ongoing campaign of repression and mass detention of Uyghurs and others in the Uyghur region that the U.S. State Department has called genocide. Authorities have interrogated residents for storing Quranic text on their phones and coerced minority workers into labor transfers under the guise of poverty alleviation. These policies have been accompanied by forced sterilizations and other abuses that may amount to crimes against humanity. And Uyghur and Tibetan school children are separated from their parents and forced to attend state-run boarding schools. Hong Kong also faces intensifying repression. For many years, Hong Kong was a beacon of freedom, including religious freedom. Today, the national security law and Beijing's broader policy of Sinicization have sharply eroded those freedoms and pose a direct threat to the future of religious freedom in Hong Kong. Churches are pressured to self-censor, sermons increasingly avoid political themes, and religious schools are mandated to teach a curriculum that emphasizes the protection of national security, similar to China's patriotic education law on the mainland. Under the NSL, individuals can face up to 14 years in prison for knowing that someone has committed so-called treason, but failing to report it in timely fashion, meaning that priests could be forced to choose between going to jail or divulging information shared with them by parishioners during confession. And as you heard Mr. Destro mention, some political prisoners are actually denied access to their religious rights within Hong Kong prison. China's campaign of transnational repression represents the most sophisticated and far-reaching in the world. We maintain a global database that documents direct physical incidents of transnational repression, and 22% of the cases we have documented since 2014 were committed by the Chinese government. These include unlawful deportations, assaults, and harassment in 30 countries, as well as surveillance, intimidation, coercion of family members, mobility controls, detention, and Interpol abuse. Religious and ethnic minorities are prime targets for transnational repression, and most of these incidents were directed against Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Falun Gong practitioners. Often, it is not even because of any activism these folks are doing, but simply because of their identity. There are a number of steps the US government should take to promote and defend religious freedom in China. First and foremost, we agree with this commission that China should be redesignated as a country of particular concern. The United States should also work to enforce accountability. This can include by imposing targeted sanctions on officials and entities responsible for a severe religious persecution. As you all know, the International Religious Freedom Act and the Global Magnitsky Act provide the ability to do so. When sanctions are imposed, they should not be dual-hatted. They should be imposed in a cumulative fashion and in coordination with other democracies as much as possible. Policymakers should strengthen asylum protections and humanitarian pathways for Uyghurs, Tibetans, Christians, and Falun Gong practitioners at risk. And this is something that will be very important to keep in mind as the US immigration system is reviewed. The US government should also work to expose transnational repression by coordinating with allies to monitor, document, and counter China's unlawful deportations, harassment of diaspora communities, and abuse of Interpol red notices, and take special care to not facilitate in the perpetration of transnational repression. The US should support civil society resilience by funding documentation, independent media, and diaspora organizations, which often provide lifelines to persecuted religious groups. And the US should integrate religious freedom into all US-China bilateral and multilateral dialogues at every level, in every conversation. We deeply agree with Mr. Destro that issues of fundamental rights and freedom are part and parcel to national security and economic prosperity. Despite China's religious persecution, millions of believers continue to practice their faith, often at immense personal risk. We have actually documented more than 400 instances of dissent as part of our China Dissent Monitor project. These are instances in which religious believers have continued to practice their faith and worship, or even protest for religious freedom, despite the extreme danger that they face for doing so. Their resilience reminds us that religious freedom is not a secondary concern. It is central to human dignity, to civil society, and to the defense of democracy worldwide. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all for your very insightful testimonies. I think we've had a good preview here of all the atrocities that the Chinese Communist Party is inflicting on its people and why we must stand strong for religious freedom. So at this time, though, we're going to enter the Q&A session, and I want to announce we are going to extend this hearing by 15 minutes. It's such an important topic, and all the commissioners have questions we want to explore with these experts in the field. And I'm going to start with a couple of questions. First, regarding the status of children in China. So just a little background, I was a state representative for 6 years from Missouri back in the 90s and had the opportunity to travel to China. And I was struck by the fact that it is illegal to talk to a child about their faith. Yet at the same time, the CCP was sponsoring camps, summer camps, and youth programs all over the country, encouraging the children to learn the CCP doctrines and the songs and everything else, indoctrinating the next generation. Several of you in your testimony mentioned children a little bit. Could you all briefly share what you're seeing, the impact of the children and the indoctrination going on, and the kidnapping and taking away children from their families that's happening in different communities? And so I guess we could start with you, Annie. Could you share a little bit what you're seeing?
Sure, absolutely. And I would actually love to just defer to Mr. Tenzin and Ms. Abbas because their communities have been directly impacted by all of this. I would just say, as brief framing remarks, we have documented for years in our reports the forced removal of especially Tibetan and Uyghur children, although other faiths have been impacted. And this separation of families is deliberate and designed to really inculcate kids with this patriotic Chinese nationalist identity that really removes any ethnic or religious belief or expression that they may have come from. So I will stop there and defer. I don't know which of you want to take it first, but you have
Ms. Abbas, why don't you share?
Thank you so much. And yes, under the policies of Chen Chuanguo, the former party secretary, have once said, break their lineage. There means by the Uyghurs, break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections, and break their origins. They have taken more than 1 million Uyghur children to the state-run orphanages, while those kids have their parents still alive, but they have absolutely no communications with them. And the Uyghur children there must speak Chinese, and they have no connections to their culture or religion. And they are being raised as loyal followers of the Chinese Communist Party. So this is not just a way of assimilating the Uyghurs, but also raising them against their family's cultural heritage, and they become, the true followers of the Chinese Communist Party. So this is actually being a part of the genocide. Thank you.
Unbelievable. It's heartbreaking for those parents. It's truly evil. Mr. Tenzin, would you like to expound on what's happening to the Tibetan children?
Thank you, Chair. So the rights of the Tibetan children is a major issue for us, as it has already been spoken about briefly in the remarks. There's like over 1 million Tibetan children in Chinese boarding schools, and all of these children have to undergo political indoctrination, and it begins from like kindergarten age. That is like 5 or 6 years, beginning from there. And so this thing has been going on, this policy has been going on for several years now, unfortunately, and it is still continuing. And the effects, that's something that we are seeing now also, like, I've been told by one of the journalists, without naming a name, a Reuters journalist, basically saying that, she went for a tour in Tibet, and, she found that, a mother and a daughter in Lhasa, and they were not able to communicate because the daughter speaks only Chinese and the mother could hardly speak Chinese. So that is bringing this kind of a gap between the families. And then there are also some certain instances where the children are telling their parents to speak Chinese, unfortunately, because that's what they have been taught in these boarding schools.
Sure.
And apart from that, I think also, like, say, if I want to elaborate, last year around, I think, September, one private monastic school was shut down with 500 young monks, all expelled from the monastic school. And I was researching why was this happening in that particular area of Tibet. And I was like digging through the Chinese government documents. And what I found was that, this in that particular prefecture, that is the Ngaba prefecture, the state, the prefecture education board requires political indoctrination in all the schools, and that is in their document, right? And they've in that report they also say like 69 kindergartens in the area have been closed, 8 have
Yeah.
been merged, and all of these things are happening. These are all targeting the children.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It's very disheartening. My second question, I guess I'd like to address it to Mr. Destro. You raised the issue with diplomacy and how important it is that we bring these issues up when we are talking to the government officials. And I don't think many Americans know that the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 that Congress passed that established this commission elevated religious freedom equal in our foreign policy to economic topics, national security topics. So theoretically, the way the law is supposed to work, whenever our government, whether it be the president or secretary of state, meets with a foreign head of government, especially in ones that are violating religious freedom, this should be part of discussion. Should it not? Say, and you're more familiar, you've been in some of these discussions. How does this conversation work? For instance, our country is going to be meeting with President Xi Jinping very soon, I'm understanding. What do you think it should be the conversation?
Well, it's a really good question, and I thank you for it. There's what you need to be doing is talking with the other side, not at them. And unfortunately, a lot of human rights discussions, are, where we're basically sitting there telling people what they should be doing, and they resent it. I am a big advocate, for example, of protecting religious minorities in Nigeria. When I went to Nigeria as a diplomat, you could see the hostility across the room from the Nigerian side. And so this means there's a lot of different ways to convey a message. Sometimes you have to do it indirectly, and so the conversation, for example, I spent a lot of time working on and helping to draft the Uyghur genocide statement that Secretary Pompeo issued. I mean, the amount of fighting within the State Department about whether or not we should do it was staggering. And so you can't even begin to script out a meeting, with a foreign leader and try to inject religious freedom concerns unless you get everybody on your own team on the same page. And what I fear is that they're not.
Well, quickly, what do you think the best scenario would be going in with Xi Jinping next week?
Well, I would think that the best thing would be to take a look at if I were putting together the packet for the president, I'd have him mention it. I would certainly have him mention it, but I would also have a countervailing, and if we don't see some progress, we're going to do X.
Yeah.
And it could be cultural, diplomatic, whatever it is. Maybe we'll just send their consul home for a couple of weeks just to make the point.
Sure. Well, I think it's there's certainly some very pertinent issues that could be brought up, certainly with the arrest of as the pastor Ezra Jin, with Ms. Abbas's sister. So I would think you want to lower the tariffs, maybe let Ms. Abbas's sister out, and maybe release Wang Yi, maybe release Pastor. Anyway, that's just some thoughts that I have that maybe could be part of that conversation. But thank you so much. I'd like to now turn to our Vice Chair, Asif Mahmood.
Again, thank you so much for all of you giving us such a factual picture and covering in this short period of time almost all the groups. So I am going to concentrate on the groups which are unrecognized groups like Falun Gongs and Church of Almighty God and few other which we don't know much. And reason I'm going to ask about this thing, and my question is going to be more posed towards Secretary Destro and Ms. Boisian from Freedom Hall. Reason is because you cover everybody. These are the groups who do not have a whole lot of advocacy or support out of China. Outside China. Other groups like Christians and Muslims and Buddhists have quite a bit of support everywhere. And we do not really know the extent of brutality because they are unrecognized and a lot of information don't come out. What can be done to find the exact extent? In spite of all this oppression and repression, these groups, according to whatever I researched, are gaining momentum and they are increasing in number every year. So how can we find the exact extent and what more the Chinese Communist Party is doing to press them? What more we can do over here for these groups who do not have really as much voice as other groups have or as much support as other groups have, and how we can make them highlighted at every level, every step, every way we can, so that this is a huge number. Falun Gong might be the biggest minority group there probably now. So I just want to ask both of you what can be done. I'm pretty sure you have done a lot of work over decades, and I want to know a little bit more. Thank you.
Sure, Mr. Destro, do you want to start? And then I'm happy to
No,
follow
no,
up.
why don't you go ahead and start and I'll wrap up.
Sure, absolutely. Well, we certainly have documented repression against Falun Gong and other undocumented groups. It's obviously in an environment like China impossible to know the total extent, but this is where diaspora communities come, their firsthand accounts from family members who sneak messages out are just really critical. And the Falun Gong community actually has worked hard to document their experiences. And many of the officials who were involved in the initial crackdown on Falun Gong practitioners did such a quote unquote good job and had perfected their techniques so well that they were actually moved over to the Uyghur region to implement the crackdown that happened there. And as other issues have rightly gotten attention in terms of who is being persecuted on the mainland, some folks have thought, oh, things are dying down for Falun Gong practitioners. That's actually not the case. There are still current cases where folks are being put into prison. There are incidents of transnational oppression where folks in the United States and elsewhere have family members who are experiencing pressure and threats and even imprisonment back home. And we hear time and time again from every persecuted community that raising the names of specific prisoners can really have quite a life-changing difference in terms of how people are treated in prison. And there was actually even an interesting campaign that some Falun Gong practitioners did a few years back where they actually got phone calls into some of the prisons where people were being held and were able to talk directly to the jailers. And it was quite effective. So these grassroots efforts and staying connected to eyewitness accounts from communities have been a really critical component of our work at Freedom House.
Thanks. I think that's very helpful. Let me pick one. I think it's a really good idea to pick one problem set and dissect that a little bit. And talking about transnational repression, a really good example, because this is not just the Chinese in China. This is China reaching its arm out and running quote unquote police stations in cities like New York and Minneapolis and everything else. My reaction is every single one of those has to be shut down. They have to, all the people need to be put in jail. And if they're not properly, I should say, I'm sorry, they don't have diplomatic immunity, so they could be put in jail and then swap for other prisoners, for example. So this is looking at Tibet. Tibet, you have now, 75 years of experience watching what the Chinese Communist Party has done to the people of Tibet. Now we're dealing with diaspora communities, and how do we help them stay together? I addressed some of the follow the money questions. What can you do? And a lot of the implementation of of these kind of outreach to diaspora and other questions are questions of where are you going to put your resources? And that's a conversation that we can't have today, but it's a conversation I really think we should be engaged with you and the other commissioners, Madam Chair, on what do we do?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Vice Chair, have any other follow-up right now?
Yes, I have a lot of questions, but I think I'm going to give time to other commissioners because they have, especially Steve, have a lot of knowledge about the area. So I'll defer my next questions to my next two colleagues there.
You bet. Thank you very much. Commissioner Ferguson. I think need to unmute there.
Hi there. Thank you so much for this, to all of you, for this very moving testimony, very informative. Maybe I'll throw out two questions. The first for Mr. Tenzin regarding the selection of the Dalai Lama's successor. I'm wondering if you could expand upon your recommendations for how the U.S. government can take action with regard to the, inevitable CCP interference in the Dalai Lama's succession plan. And then my second question is for Corey Jackson. I'm wondering if you can just elaborate and share a little bit more about the Zion Church and Pastor Jin and the 21 other prisoners. It seems this is a very, very big development because it is the largest underground church. So I'm wondering if you can contextualize that for us a little bit and give recommendations, like specifically what can the U.S. government do to be helpful?
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Tenzin, you want to go first?
Thank you for the question. So about the particular question of the Dalai Lama's reincarnation, because this has been returning questions for many, many years. And I think people had a lot of questions whether there will be a 15th Dalai Lama or not, or how is it going to be in the future. But I think this past July, I think His Holiness the Dalai Lama has made it very, very clear that, I think I should just read out the crucial passage from his statement. He concludes about his reincarnation. He states that, I hereby reiterate that the Ganden Potang Trust has the sole authority to recognize the future reincarnation. No one else has any such authority to interfere in this matter. And I think, it is this, in a way, puts to rest many of the speculation whether there will be a 15th Dalai Lama or not. So there will be a 15th Dalai Lama according to this statement. And it is very, very clear, explicitly stated that no one else has any authority to interfere in this religious process. It is something that is very deeply connected in the Tibetan sacred belief system. And certainly the Communist Party of China does not understand it and does not have any authority to interfere in it. On the question of recommendation of how to deal with it, because I think we are quite certain that looking by the precedents that have been set so far, that and the laws that have been promulgated for many, many years now, beginning from 2007, specifically the measures on the selection of the reincarnation lamas, which is in a way is the legal basis to control the next Dalai Lama. And in terms of precedents, I think we all know what happened to the Panchen Lama that was who was disappeared in 1995. That is the real Panchen Lama that was recognized by the Dalai Lama and by the Tibetan people. And he has not been seen so far. He's been disappeared since 1995 and he continues to be disappeared. That is very unfortunate. So these are the precedents that we have seen. And we certainly know that because there's a whole legal framework now to deal with the Chinese government's trying to control the institution of the Dalai Lama.
So what recommendations would you give the U.S. government quickly?
Oh, I think as a recommendation, I think I will definitely, coming to one point, it is certain that they will interfere. The CCP will definitely interfere. And when that interference happens, I think the US government should stand by the Tibetan people and like do whatever is in their capacity, from sanctioning the Chinese authorities, and also making it very clear that it is something that the state and the party, Communist Party, cannot interfere in it.
Great. Thank you so much. That's very, very concerning development. Corey Jackson, Mr. Jackson, you want to answer the other question there, please?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I appreciate everyone's concern. So yeah, to put it in context, so Zion Church Beijing is the largest house church in China. So back in 2018, there was a crackdown on many churches, responding to the religious regulations of 2018. It came out in February, and Zion Church, Early Rain Church were two of the targets of this. So Zion Church was shut down. They were having regular worship services of around 1,700 people per Sunday. They were, forcibly shut down. There were surveillance cameras installed. All the pastors were followed. They've been under constant harassment since then. Ezra Jin is the founding pastor of the church, the senior pastor. His daughter lives here in Washington, D.C. His two other children, his daughter's a U.S. citizen. His two other children are U.S. citizens. His wife also lives in Chicago. So this is a matter for us to be concerned about. As one of the folks that came on video, I can't remember who said, this is a matter that touches us here, even in Washington. And so yeah, what's happened is there's been across 10 cities, 8 to 10 cities. Originally, around 30 people were arrested. Now it's down to 22. Some people have been released. Two or three of the people that have been released, we can't find them. We don't know their whereabouts right now. So that's very concerning. Those 22 who have been arrested are in Beihai, and there are 13 women. There are 9 men. They're being held in number 1 and number 2 detention centers. Some are parents of young children. Some are on the older side. One positive thing to report is that 10 were able to meet with their attorneys, which is actually unheard of. We think that's because of the international attention and pressure that's coming. They've all been charged with suspicion of illegally using an information network, which we think is the early implementation of new laws for clergy that came out in September. So this is just probably the very first sign. They tend to go after the bigger churches to send a signal down the line. This is a way that China typically does it. So we think that the targeting of Zion is them sending a signal to everyone that we're coming after you, preventing you from meeting online. In terms of the context for geopolitics, I'll just say that Pastor Jin's detention is not occurring in a vacuum. The CCP nabbed him 2 days after there were escalations in the ongoing trade war between the U.S. and China. On October 8th, the Chinese government announced new restrictions on rare earth materials. President Trump responded by threatening to increase tariff rates if China did not back down. So Trump and Xi are slated to meet on the sidelines of the APEC summit here at the end of the month. We hope that happens. But I would say that since then, at times, it seems that the U.S. may be backing off from its criticism of the CCP's abysmal human rights record in the hopes of a deal. And we appreciate the Secretary of State's comments very much about this, but sometimes we wonder how seriously we're going to take this in these conversations. But we would just advocate that Pastor Jin's detention and the 21 others who have been detained be front and center of conversations that happen in Seoul, Korea, where those meetings are going to happen. We also want to note that the CCP is notorious for taking political prisoners to use as leverage points in key diplomatic moments, which kind of demand that the U.S. withhold criticism of the regime's serious ongoing rights violations. And so given this repeated pattern, we would just encourage the U.S. to not sideline these conversations in this moment in attempts to make a deal and to make these front and center.
Maybe if I can just jump in and briefly give slightly more context, really agree with all of that. And there are a lot of cases of smaller incidents that don't hit the light of day, but really give you a sense of the environment in which folks are trying to operate. So there was an individual trying to sell affordable Bibles online. They were charged with illegal business operations. There were some churches funding schools. They were similarly charged with illegal business operations. People who were trying to fundraise for their own churches were charged with scamming. So it's really a very daily thing for so many people who are religious believers outside the confines of, the officially sanctioned churches.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that additional insight there. Commissioner Schneck.
Thank you, Chair Hartzler. I'm going to follow a bit on Reverend Jackson's comments. This is my 4th year on the commission. I'm coming to the end of my tenure on the commission. And I have to say that in the course of those 4 years, I've seen things only get worse and worse in regards to China. Sinicization is continuing apace. The genocide of the Uyghurs and the cultural genocide of the Tibetans is continuing apace. And I'm really wondering if over these 4 years, USCIRF has had any effect at all. If any of the recommendations that we've made to Congress, if any of the recommendations that we've made now to 2 different administrations have had any success at all in changing the situation of religious freedom in China. And I offer this as an open question to any of the panelists.
Well, if I may, I think it's an open question, but I think it's not only an open question with respect to USCIRF. I think it's an open question with respect to the human rights funding we've been doing around the world. What do we get for it? There's a lot of effort that goes into holding hearings like this and issuing reports. I was in charge of the human rights reports when I was assistant secretary, and I know just how controversial those things can be and how every word was negotiated with the host country. So the short answer is, we have some homework to do because if the answer is we haven't been effective, we then have to start asking the question, well, why is that? And I think there are plenty of good answers to those questions, but it requires the commission to take a hard look at what our own people are doing in diplomatic forums, first.
I would jump in and say yes, right? So there are a whole bunch of recommendations that the religious freedom community has made for decades that haven't ever been fully implemented. And we see this happen when religious freedom and other fundamental rights issues are sidelined and taken out of conversations about economics and security. And we, I think, on this screen are all in agreement that you can't have true security or prosperity if you're not upholding and respecting rights for everyone. And someone made the point, a secure regime doesn't feel the need to crack down on forms of dissent. The other thing to remember is that dissent is occurring. And just because we don't necessarily see it from where we sit here in the United States, it happens every single day. So we have a project called the China Dissent Monitor that uses a variety of on-the-ground information and online information to document instances of dissent that are happening on the mainland, because it's often assumed there's no dissent. And so we have seen instances of folks talking about environmental issues, labor issues, but also, as I mentioned, more than 400 instances over the last 3 years where people see religious restriction and choose to worship anyway, or where they're even actually protesting. And so then this comes back to, from our perspective, the deep and utter importance of raising individual cases, because we do hear that it makes a difference. And when USCIRF encourages State Department to designate China as a country of particular concern, it matters. The Chinese government cares about that. They raise it in meetings. Mr. Destro would know more how many meetings it comes up in, but we hear that it's a real point of contention. Also, the imposition of targeted sanctions during the Hong Kong protests. Former Chief Executive Carrie Lam went on television and complained how difficult the Magnitsky sanctions made her daily life, and that really encouraged folks to continue taking to the streets. So I think there's a lot more we need to do, and there's a lot happening that we don't necessarily see day in and day out.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Right. Commissioner Schneck, you have another follow-up question?
I do not. Thank you very much.
Well, this has been a very eye-opening, heart-wrenching, but also impactful hearing today. Hearing all of the atrocities that the CCP is inflicting on its citizens, and the importance of speaking out for those who can't speak for themselves in China, what they're enduring, and incorporating it into our public policy to make this front and center. Some of our witnesses said, and to summarize, that the Chinese Communist Party is inflicting a war, it's conducting a war on faith itself. And they're replacing God with the party. They're saying, worship the CCP or be deleted. The CCP is issued through their citizenization a blueprint of control. They're indoctrinating the next generation of children, and this has got to stop. So I'm thankful we live in a country that has passed this law, that has put religious freedom front and center in our foreign policy. And I'm hopeful that this administration will do like it did 4 years ago and make it front and center in every discussion with diplomacy. There are opportunities. I'm excited about the meeting later this month with Chairman Xi Jinping. And I'm hopeful that our president and our Secretary of State will use this opportunity to raise these issues. So let us continue to hope that things change, to advocate, to work hard, to speak out for these individuals. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here. I want to thank our members of Congress for weighing in and for their work in Congress. And I want to thank everyone in the audience who's took time, who cares about this issue, to listen. Let's not give up, not lose heart. Let's keep going, and hopefully we will see more freedom for these people we care about so much in China. This now concludes our hearing.